Welcome to For the Church, a podcast with the flock of Zion Presbyterian Church in Columbia, Tennessee. We want to help you think biblically about everyday matters. Zion Church exists to join Jesus in his mission to reach people with the gospel and then to equip his people to worship and serve. I'm your host, Keaton and Paul, and joining me is my conversation partner and co-host, Seth Scruggs. So here we are, continuing on our journey through the church, on For the Church, which I might have said for every episode thus far, so why not keep it going? But before we get into today's episode, hey Seth, how are you?
I'm good.
Yeah?
You take great joy in saying the church on For the Church. It's really fun. I am very good.
Okay.
It's nice and chilly outside. Oh, beautiful.
It's peak fall.
Yeah.
And if you don't like fall in Middle Tennessee, I think you're wrong. I think you're wrong.
That's the correct opinion. 100%.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. Honestly, if you don't like fall in Middle Tennessee,
If you don't like fall, period.
yeah, move to Florida. Okay? Become Florida man and do absurd things that make it in the news. Florida man. But anyway,
The church.
the church.
We're funneling down.
Yes. So we've started this sort of series on the church. And this isn't really church history per se. It's like church history adjacent, which apparently people are into church history. I thought that was just me. Apparently there's more. Who knew? But the way we're doing it, at least this time, maybe if you want a thing on church history proper, leave a comment in the comments section and say, I want more church history, and then say what you want about church history, early church history, medieval church history, a particular person, the development of a certain doctrine, the Reformation, any of these things. Tell us anything. Please talk to us, please. But what we're doing as we study the church is starting out with a wide lens of saying, what is a church? And then looking at the church from the early church and narrowing it in on this particular church, Zion Presbyterian Church. And last time, we looked at the various branches of the church, Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, and the Protestant movement. Last time we looked at Protestantism at large. And now we're looking more into the tradition that we're in and from within Protestantism, the Reformed and Presbyterian tradition. I do think it is noteworthy for us to say that you and I both, in fact, belong to the Reformed and Presbyterian tradition, not by birth, but by conviction and adoption. We were not born in Reformed or Presbyterian traditions.
Nope.
And yet here we are. And so I don't know what you want to do with that, but I think that's a generally good observation.
Yeah, it's definitely worth noting that we are not people where this is what we were told our whole lives. And so we're all in on this particular thing. This is something that we both kind of come to, as you said, convictionally.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
Yeah. So let's start with those names. Reformed and Presbyterian. Reformed, what is Reformed theology? A potential series for the church. Tell us if you want to hear what. Anyway, Reformed theology, as broadly brushed as we can make it, is the theology of the Reformation, particularly after the time of Luther, more kind of codified by the likes of Calvin and Geneva, and then that stream continuing on. Bullinger and others would kind of fall in that thing, but we'll get there. So when we say Reformed theology, and this is always a crucial thing to ask, because a lot of people use the term Reformed theology, and you say, okay, me too, and then you start talking, you're like, wait a minute, that's a different thing than what I was talking about, but okay. when we say Reformed theology, we're painting in a very broad brush, at least for now, the theology that stems from the Reformation. Presbyterian, properly understood, is primarily not so much about a theological system as much as it is a polity, a church polity system. So Presbyterian comes from the Greek word presbyteros, which means elders. And it's the conviction that church governance is not by way of a pyramid scheme or from like a top-down sort of thing or like a pure, undefiled democracy. Presbyterian polity is by way of a plurality of elders who are mutually accountable, not only to each other in a local church context, but accountable to other pastors in other local churches in regions and nations and even internationally. So it's a form of polity. And so we're going to use those terms interchangeably. Reformed theology is a system of theology developed from the Reformation. Presbyterian, I think, which holds to certain confessional standards, holds to Reformed theology, but the term itself is referring to a church polity, properly understood. So those are what those two words mean. Now then, where did they come from? Well, you go back to the Reformation itself. You have a few key proponents. See our episode previous to this one on Protestantism. You have the works of Martin Luther. And as we all know, Luther is the forefather of Lutheranism, thus the name. But there's this other stream going on during the Reformation that somewhat coincides with a guy by the name of Ulrich Zwingli and others, Heinrich Bullinger, and eventually is codified by a great systematizer, the systematizer par excellence of the Reformation, I think, a Frenchman of all things. The French got two things right. John Calvin and French fries. That's exactly right. You heard it here, folks. So anyway, Calvin, a Frenchman, a wonderful scholar of the humanities, a lawyer by trade, through a miraculous work of God, finds himself in Geneva. He doesn't want to be there, but he is, and he's the pastor in the church in Geneva, and really he finds a need to write basically a handbook for these pastors who are being cranked out of Geneva to go plant churches around Europe, oftentimes go back into France where the Protestant church is highly persecuted, to write down for them a handbook for the Christian ministry. And it goes through a variety of editions and eventually becomes known as the Institutes of the Christian Religion, its final form in 1559. And that, in so many ways, really is like sort of the full-orbed, codified textbook of what is Reformed theology. Calvin's Institutes are they. And Calvin, as his work in Geneva continues on, he's not just a pastor or a theologian. In fact, he views himself primarily as a pastor. But another thing he views himself as is a pastor who trains other pastors. And Geneva, which he is really kind of the pastor of and overseeing a lot of that sort of development, forms a theological school, what we could call something adjacent to a seminary today. The academy in Geneva. And from that, all of these pastors are flocking to Geneva to study under Calvin and the scholars who follow after suit with Calvin. And it begins to kind of run throughout the continent of Europe. Churches are being planted. People are coming to a saving knowledge of the faith. They're taking in these Reformed convictions. One of the primary things is both a study of the scriptures in their original language and then a translation and proclamation of those scriptures in the common languages of the people. So it's a massive, a deep understanding. There's a deep academic study that's going on in this Reformed tradition, but also it's a sending movement that sends people and then takes what is deeply academic and then makes it practical. And I think that's probably, at least for you and I both, one of the great draws of being Reformed and Presbyterian is that very thing, is the depth of study, the convictions that arise from the text of Scripture, but then not simply staying in the academic endeavor, but bringing it not only into church life, but everyday life. And Calvin was a master of that. And it really kind of develops there. There are a variety of pastors going on, churches that are mutually accountable in Geneva and elsewhere. And so many people are coming to this from all over Europe. One such eventually will be a Scotsman who was a Catholic priest and a bodyguard of sorts who had Protestant convictions. He's arrested. He ends up being a slave. And a ship slave, forced to hard labor for quite a long time, and then is set free. So he flees his persecuted Scotland and goes to Geneva, studies there, learns there, and comes back to Scotland. His name was John Knox. And Knox preaches this fiery gospel that he learns a lot from Geneva, studying Calvin's Institutes and the theology that has arisen from that, and bringing it into the English-speaking world as this kind of primary progenitor of Reformed and Presbyterian theology. And in so many ways, the term Presbyterian actually is really on the continent of Europe that it's often referred to as Reformed. So you have the Dutch Reformed tradition with their three forms of unity. You have the German Reformed tradition. You have the Swiss Reformed tradition, which subscribes to the Helvetic Confession. But then it's brought across the pond, if you will, by a guy named John Knox, and it suddenly takes on the name Presbyterian. And so these are cousins of each other. To be continentally Reformed and Presbyterian are closely linked. There's the common denominator of Calvin and Geneva, but Knox carries this brand, and it develops primarily in Scotland, is exported eventually to England in the 1500s on into the early 1600s. And it coincides quite a bit with what's going on further south in England itself, with the development of Anglicanism, and then arises on the scene the Puritans. The term Puritan, properly understood, is a person, a priest within the Anglican Church, an Anglican priest who is seeking to purify the church. So there are people who are sometimes called Puritans who are technically not Puritans. Correctly and more succinctly, or I guess more accurately stated, they're non-conformists, but we just call them Puritans. But it's quite a hodgepodge of conviction as things kind of arise to the surface. And so they say, we need to figure out, this is the church in England now, we need to figure out, we've got a new movement. We have this movement with Oliver Cromwell, overseen by really kind of this, grand assembly. It's not so much ruled by a king, but by people. We need to revise the state church. And so we need to, likewise, in order to do that, revise the confessional standards, which at that time were the 39 Articles. We're going to develop the 39 Articles and call this council together, this assembly in the 1640s, and have a variety of the best and finest that England has to offer from a variety of perspectives, and have some Scottish delegates as well. And so out of that arises the Westminster Standards, the Westminster Confession, and the Westminster Larger and Shorter Catechism. Eventually, though, the monarchy arises. They go back to the 39 Articles and say maybe that Westminster stuff was a little heavy-handed. It's a little too precise for us. I'm joking to all of my Anglican friends, but not really. I love y'all too. I know you're throwing shade at me. It's fine. I love you guys. You're doing good work, probably. So the Westminster Standards arrives, and it's adopted by the Church of Scotland, which is Presbyterian. It's not actually accepted by the Anglican Church, which was the group that actually wrote it. It's accepted by the Presbyterians. There were Presbyterians, Scottish Presbyterians, that were there as delegates at the Westminster Assembly. Dear brother Samuel Rutherford. But nonetheless, so it's adopted. Presbyterians, what is your confessional standards? It is the Westminster Standards. And so what does it mean really from the 1640s onward to be Presbyterian? Well, one, it means polity-wise, as far as church polity is concerned, you believe not in the autonomy of individual churches, and you also don't believe in the office of the bishopric or the episcopacy. You believe that there are really elders, pastors, ministers that are mutually accountable to each other, both locally, regionally, and nationally, one thing. And then you subscribe to the Westminster Standards. And that is, in essence, really, even today, what is the Presbyterian? Well, it's actually those two things. You believe in Presbyterian polity, and you hold to the theology of the Westminster Standards. That was a lot about 100-ish years in a short amount of time. But before we jump to Presbyterianism in America, which will take me a little bit more words, what do you think?
Yeah, it's so funny because I grew up in a denomination, in the Southern Baptist denomination, which has a less lengthy history, just in terms of how it has been formed. And so it's really crazy because we, in our context, if you're watching and you're not from Columbia, Tennessee, there are a handful of Presbyterian churches, only one in our particular Presbyterian denomination, which we'll get to, but which is the one we're in. And in, you know, the general area. And so for many people in our context, that's what it means to go to church, is a smaller autonomous church. And so to have this kind of history is just, it's different. And it was a real learning curve for me. So we both I went to college, you went to seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, which as the home of Reformed Theological Seminary, it is home to a lot of PCA churches and Presbyterian churches in general, other EPC, OPC, tons of them. And I was kind of thrust into this world then of like people talking about the Puritans and the Westminster Standards and these things that I had no clue about. Like I just didn't know that it was a thing. And so it's funny just as we talk about this, recognizing that there is such a lengthy history that even if you are convictionally not Reformed and Presbyterian, can be very valuable. Like you pointed out, like Anglicans wrote the Westminster Standards for the most part. And so there is this kind of cross-denominational thing to it.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I would encourage people to read the Westminster Standards. I would venture to say, one, it's not as long as you think. You can get through it like pretty quick, especially if you have a version that's like just the text of the Westminster Standards without the proof texts. It's not a huge document, but it's very thoughtful. And I think there's a lot of it that almost any kind of Bible-believing, creedal affirming, that means you affirm one of the great creeds, the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed, that you'll look to and be like, yeah, sure, this checks plenty of boxes for me, of course, and so
highly recommend Chad Van Dixhoorn's Confessing the Faith if you are interested in the Westminster Standards, but you're a little nervous about it because the these and thous and hasts and all of that. Highly recommend his work. That has the traditional language, also has the more modern language, and then some exposition on it that you could skip through if you wanted to. Though it's very good. I would recommend reading it. But relevant to our conversation, it also has certain American updates to the Westminster Standards.
It does.
So where we are in our story so far, Presbyterianism is in Scotland. They've adopted the Westminster Standards. We haven't made it to America yet.
That's right. So Presbyterianism, there was the Church of England. That is what we refer to as Anglicans. And there was the Church of Scotland. And the Church of Scotland was the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. It brings forth a variety of questions of church-state relations. So let's fast forward to America. America is slowly colonized in the early 1600s by primarily English speakers. This is kind of, again, broad brush, but we're trying to get to Presbyterianism here, so just bear with me.
Skip over a few details.
See, we're going to skip over a lot of details, but so England, Mayflower, this sort of thing is happening early 1600s. Most of the Pilgrims, or the Puritans, who they were, nonconformists of some sorts, coming here from England, were primarily Congregationalists. The Congregationalists are those who probably have lots in common with the Westminster Standards. There were Congregationalists who were a part of the Assembly of the Westminster Standards. Quite a few, in fact.
Could you define Congregationalist?
Yes, a Congregationalist is a person, especially in the Puritan sort, they subscribe to Reformed theology as a system of doctrine, but their church polity is different from Presbyterianism in that Congregationalists believe that each church is autonomous to itself. So there's not a kind of mutual, oversight.
This would be more like the traditions that both of us grew up in.
Yes. And
very common in
Baptist, non-denominational. Your church can kind of do what you want. And the way most decisions are made, they have Congregationalists have historically had elders. But a lot of things were brought before a congregational vote. And, if there was an appeal, there wasn't like a presbytery.
A lot of church business meetings.
Yes.
Just so many
church business meetings. So many. Primarily, though, the early settlers, the early Pilgrims, Puritans in America were Congregationalist. That said, in the early 1600s, roughly somewhere around 1620-ish or so, there is a steady trickle of Reformed, Puritan-type Presbyterians arriving in America. It presents a certain issue because of a Presbyterian polity. You're arriving in a foreign land that's thousands of miles away across a very large body of water to the presbytery where all the other churches, so the mutual accountability is kind of difficult. So they're like, what do we do? I don't know, but we know we can't live in England right now, so America's kind of our best bet. So let's come here and figure out how this works. So there were Presbyterians by conviction in the early 1600s even. a steady trickle. And then finally, by the time we get to the early 1700s, presbyteries begin to develop. Multiple Presbyterian churches who are saying, hey, we're regionally close, and so we can have this mutual accountability. In certain colonial cities, there may be one in particular, Savannah, Georgia, very old city. There's a church there, a large Presbyterian church called Independent Presbyterian Church. Historic church. I think it was founded in 1725. Independent Presbyterian typically would be a contradiction of terms. Presbyterians don't believe in independency from other churches. But it was Independent Presbyterian Church because there weren't any other Presbyterian churches within 1,000 miles or so. And so they were granted permission to more or less be in some sort of relation with churches back in the old world. But at the end of the day, they were somewhat independent, and they just never changed the name. Gorgeous church, worshipped there a few times. But so you have that sort of thing in this problem. Well, suddenly by the time you get to the early 1700s, there's enough Presbyterian presence in certain colonies to form presbyteries. Georgia will eventually become one. Pennsylvania will become another, heavily influenced both. There's a strong Dutch presence there in Pennsylvania. There's also this Presbyterian, and so they kind of work those things out. The Carolinas will often develop pretty quickly as well. And so there are presbyteries founded in the early 1700s, and a growing, even influential Presbyterian presence in colonial America. But it's around this sort of time that, in fact, even in early colonial America, that Presbyterians and Congregationalists, so the two kind of forms of Puritanism, begin to converge and intermingle in a lot of ways. And a movement begins to spark within colonial America in the early 1700s, which sparks both from the ministry, interestingly enough, of more Anglicans. So this is bizarre. The Anglicans, the Presbyterians, and the Congregationalists all having this weird intermixed constant family reunion. The Anglicans, John Wesley, and maybe even more so, George Whitefield, become hugely influential, particularly Whitefield. And Whitefield's ministry takes effect. His evangelistic preaching runs wild. He really is, in so many ways, George Whitefield is, the first celebrity in American history. Go figure. And somebody following right in line with Whitefield, who was a dear friend of Whitefield, was a guy by the name of Jonathan Edwards, a Congregationalist. He wasn't Presbyterian, but he had certain convictions. And so, anyway, Presbyterianism begins to develop. There's this, unique kind of simpatico relation between Presbyterian, Congregationalist, Anglican. They're all kind of working together, jiving. And then this first, what we refer to at least, the First Great Awakening takes place. It sparks, carries, and kind of runs throughout colonial America. And oftentimes when something like revival happens, there's tension. And so one of the earliest kind of things talked about in early American Presbyterianism is the old side, new side controversy. And really what the old side, new side controversy is how okay are you with the idea of revival or awakening? And then what should you do about it? Some of the old side folks were, and a huge component of this was the education credentials of Presbyterian ministers in particular. Congregationalists had their own version sort of this. But Presbyterians historically, as we said earlier, have a very high view of the trained minister. And so early colonial America one of the great kind of questions, our Puritan heritage, is how are we going to train ministers? And so one of the first ways that this is done is through Harvard in its earliest days, which was really just based on Oxford. Eventually, Harvard doesn't take long before they more or less kind of quote unquote go theologically liberal. Yale is developed. Yale goes for a while. That somewhat peters out. Princeton will eventually arise, the College of New Jersey. But the old side crew of the old side, new side controversy were staunch. Listen, you can go, I suppose, to Yale or Princeton. Probably shouldn't go to Harvard because they're going to mess with you in a way that we're not comfortable with. We want people who believe the Bible. But I suppose you can go to Yale or Princeton, primarily Princeton. We're more comfortable with that as like a warm-up. But really, if you want to get ordained in the Presbyterian Church that is in America, not to be confused with the PCA, in colonial America, really what we want you to do, we want you to go back to the old world. We want you to receive your divinity training from one of the historic medieval schools back, Oxford, Cambridge, potentially, but probably more something like, Trinity College, Dublin, perhaps, or even, St. Andrew's College or the University of Edinburgh, one of these kind of hallmark schools, and receive your divinity training there and then come back. Well, you've got all of these frontiersmen who are sitting there going, but the gospel needs to get preached. And you've got all these people out here just, who are scattered, who don't hear the gospel. And you've got, these Native Americans and we, we need an educated minister, but like we need the gospel, and it's going to take, years to go to Yale or Princeton, and then a long time to go get divinity training and then come back. And it's just and we got to get on the field now. And part of the way that this was somewhat sparked is there was a little school on the frontier that was referred to as the Log College. And the Log College was somewhat of a ministerial training started by a guy named William Tennent Sr. And there were all of these guys that were coming out of the Log College that, weren't trained at Edinburgh or the University of Glasgow or, any of these places, Aberdeen University. They're not trained in any of these places, but they're coming out here and they're like preaching these bombs, showing up on the frontier in these like preaching in barns and just laying the gospel on thick and getting it and really starting to kind of like spark this movement. We can call it, if you want, a precursor to the gospel-centered movement, or they were the young restless Reformed before that was cool. And so this controversy was like, okay, all this revivalism that we're seeing and this like kind of eagerness to go without the proper credentialing, tension. And so old side, new side, who's good, and so it's a huge thing. The solution to that eventually will become, it takes quite a while to get there, but the development first of the College of New Jersey, which will eventually become Princeton University, but then eventually in 1812, the development of Princeton Theological Seminary. And that new side of, and it's kind of a quasi new side, but that fervor, that yearning, that fire of we have a burden to take the gospel to the lost, to the nations, to our neighbors across the street and around the world. On the one side, which was more new school, but we want to do so with a depth of learning, but also with a sincere and holistic piety, which was maybe more old side. We want both of these components in all of their goodness without throwing the baby out with the bathwater on both sides, and so thus develops Princeton Theological Seminary. Princeton Theological Seminary, founded in 1812. The first professor of that was a guy by the name of Archibald Alexander, who exhibited both that fervor, that gospel preaching of those who were coming out of the Law College, sometimes called William Tennent boys. He has that. His second professor that he hires is a guy by the name of Samuel Miller, who also exhibits that same sort of thing. And in one of the early classes, they have a young man who was raised in a wonderful home, had some academic gifting. Archibald Alexander grabs him, brings him under his wing. He eventually becomes the longest professor in Princeton's history, and really is kind of the American Presbyterian theologian, if there is one. His name is Charles Hodge, doing both of those things. A missionary heart and fervor, but a capacity for academic depth that just really wasn't surpassed by any place else. And so for over a century, Princeton Theological Seminary wasn't just a premier theological training institute. Basically, across the world, it was the place. There were people who were sending their young men from England to study at Princeton in order to come back and study. And so, and it was also, interestingly enough, Princeton cranked out probably more missionaries in the 1800s than any other institution in America, maybe even the world, getting both of those things. And so it becomes really the staple. What is American Presbyterianism? Everybody will almost always refer back to old Princeton. And if they don't, they're wrong. Now, there was with that, there is a particular flavor of Presbyterianism that we can call American Presbyterianism that develops from Princeton Seminary. That's probably a little far in the weeds. So if you want to hear more on that story, put a comment in the comment section and say, I want to hear more.
Keaton would love to talk about it.
Oh gosh.
But if we're overviewing, maybe not.
Maybe not the appropriate time, but I would love to go on that journey with you all. So anyway, Princeton Seminary, it happens. It's during the 1800s. Princeton is really kind of catching fire. But another thing happens once more. That tension arises. And today, what we call the Second Great Awakening occurs. The Second Great Awakening, it's, again, very broad brush strokes here. The Second Great Awakening seems to have more privy to methodology as opposed to the First Great Awakening, which was more built on conviction. That doesn't mean that there weren't methods in the First Great Awakening, but it was less methodological, less pragmatic. And so in that time, there's another tension within American Presbyterianism, which becomes known as the Old School, New School controversy. In the New School, you have the likes of Charles Grandison Finney, who, I hope this does not offend anybody, but in my mind is the worst Presbyterian of all time. Not because I think he's a bad man. I think his theology was just wildly out of accordance with Presbyterian standards. That's just me. Okay, that's just me. But there were others who, in this sort of New School Presbyterianism, had a modified Reformed theology, a massively modified Reformed theology, a Reformed theology that was so modified, dare I say, it wasn't really Reformed anymore. And so that New School said, forget about doctrine altogether. Again, broad brush strokes here. But forget about doctrine. Who cares about doctrine at the end of the day? If people are getting converted, do whatever works. Posture difference. And so this revivalism, this in the Second Great Awakening, revivalism as contrasted with revival itself, in their redefined Reformed theology, their redefined Calvinism, pushed pragmatics in this new school. The old school, though, in the likes of guys like Charles Hodge and those who followed suit, many of which were much in favor of revival itself. They loved the work that Jonathan Edwards, and in so many ways were the predecessors of Edwards, though there were some in the new school who also, some of which were actual direct descendants of Edwards. But Hodge looked and said, that there was a difference. There's a difference. It's important. Yes, we want to be missionally minded. Yes, we want to go. Yes, we have this burden to see lost souls saved. But doctrine does matter. And because doctrine matters, practice matters too. The Christian faith is not a set of pragmatics or a method or a bullet point to-do list. It's something much, much deeper than that. And so what God has revealed to be truth actually has to take great priority. And so there was this controversy and an actual split, and many left the Presbyterian Church altogether. Others stayed, and eventually old school and new school will be reconciled, but it'll take quite a bit of time for that to happen. And it's also, interestingly enough, about this time that in America, another fairly substantial event takes place around the mid-1800s, the Civil War.
A little bit of an understatement.
A little bit of an understatement there. During the Civil War, obviously, what had been generally united-ish, there are different flavors, maybe a different accent in Presbyterianism across American history. Some of the kind of more Southern Presbyterianism, even going back to colonial America, coming by way of the Carolinas, tends to have a little bit more connection to the Scottish Presbyterianism of its day, and a lot kind of running in line with that. Whereas Northern Presbyterianism, or the Presbyterianism that took place in places like Pennsylvania or upstate New York or something like that, tended to have a slightly different accent. But when the Civil War arrives on the scene, obviously there's this, well, we got to split. And so that's when you see a real kind of differentiation between Southern Presbyterianism and Northern Presbyterianism. Obviously, Northern Presbyterianism would continue to run in the tradition of Princeton Theological Seminary and have that going with it. Southern Presbyterianism has a little bit of a different flavor, namely because of the institutions of the day. And so you can see this kind of how it develops, but things, just generally speaking, move quicker in Northern Presbyterianism and in the North in general. In the South, we move slowly, we drive slowly, we talk slowly. And so with that, the Northern and Southern Presbyterian churches actually split for well over a century. There's not a rejoinder for a long time, even after the Civil War. The Southern Presbyterian Church will change its name from the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America, I think, to the Presbyterian Church in the United States, which I'm sure probably many were bothered by. The Northern Presbyterian Church was called the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America. But anyway, as the 1800s continue to unfold, there's particularly in the Northern Presbyterian Church, there's an influx of some of of some of the theological and biblical studies that's streaming out of primarily Germany, that will become known as theological liberalism. You see the Enlightenment take hold of those early educational institutions in New England fairly quickly. Harvard becomes a Unitarian school very early. Yale was basically an answer to the Unitarian doctrine that takes over Harvard to be a strongly Trinitarian school. Yale drifts fairly early, so Princeton is developed. By the time you get to the late 1800s, early 1900s, you see a certain creep into even Princeton Theological Seminary, which was robust and conservative and Bible-believing for a long time. But German liberalism starts to take in and find its way into kind of the fabric of the university, or in the seminary, and then into the denomination. And so by the time you get to the early 19-teens and 1920s, the kind of quote unquote fundamentalist and liberal or modernist tension begins to develop. Eventually, it will come to a head in the 1920s and early 1930s in the Northern Presbyterian Church, where Princeton Seminary will split. One of its last great theologians, Benjamin Breckinridge Warfield, one of the greatest beards of all time, and one of the premier American theologians of all time, passes, I believe, in 1926. And many people say that old Princeton died when they carried Warfield's coffin out of Miller Chapel there on Princeton Seminary's campus. And so eventually by the end of the 1920s and 1929, one of the faculty members and mentees of Benjamin Breckinridge Warfield, a guy by the name of J. Gresham Machen, will leave Princeton Seminary and take some of the young up-and-comers from the faculty of Princeton to go and start a new seminary in the tradition of old Princeton that is today called Westminster Theological Seminary, as a kind of response to the liberalism that was encroaching in the Northern Presbyterian Church. Now, Westminster Seminary will have a slightly different flavor. If you want to hear that story, leave a comment in the comment section, because that's another one I would love to tell.
Go forever.
We could go forever. But anyway, that's the Northern Presbyterian Church. Things take a little bit longer to develop in the Southern Presbyterian Church. It's not until really the 1950s and 60s that the Southern Presbyterian Church really undergoes the same thing. But we'll talk about that situation in a different episode. But broadly speaking, Presbyterianism in the 20th and 21st century, in many regards, has been the story of fracturing, unfortunately, and rejoining. I don't think all fractures have been bad. I think some of them have been very necessary, and I think some of the rejoining has been glorious. But if you are to lay out, and they do have these, like a Presbyterian family tree, it is nuts. And there's all different kinds of Presbyterian denominations that develop in the 20th century and on in, to a certain degree, in the 21st century. That's not to say that there weren't various denominations of Presbyterianism even from its earliest inception in the 1700s. There were the Scottish Covenanters, who had their own version of Presbyterianism that go back very early in the Reformed Presbyterian Church North America, or the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church. All of those are Covenanter in origin, where the Presbyterian Church USA, or also PCA, what we were in, don't quite come from that same sort of lineage. So there's all kinds of differences whenever you get to the 20th century of fractures, some of which were over very important things like, can we bring ministers up on charges who deny very central and basic things to the Christian faith, such as the virgin birth or the bodily resurrection of Christ. If we can't bring ministers up on charges and, in fact, will ordain ministers who affirm such things, is this a still viable option as a denomination in a church? Seems to me that that's a broken system. But then there were other splits that were more in line of, well, there's no question about the virgin birth, but here's a bigger thing. Are you premillennial or not in your eschatology? You're not. Well, then you're not with us. So denominations formed around that. And then how staunch are you going to be about your premillennialism? And there were denominations formed about that. And what's your posture and how you take all of these things. And so anyway, there's a lot of fracturing and a lot of splits and a lot of denominational, more or less, death and a lot of denominational rejoining, which is, I think, a thing to be celebrated. But Presbyterianism today, here's what we do. I do think we see somewhat pan-denominationally in the overarching Presbyterian tradition that stands today. One thing that Presbyterians across the denominations within Presbyterianism, I think the unifying thing, and it's a very broad spectrum, but the unifying thing that Presbyterians across the spectrum have is a very high view of the educated minister. The ordination requirements for a Presbyterian minister, no matter if it's a Presbyterian Church USA or a PCA pastor or an EPC pastor, an OPC pastor or an RPCNA pastor or an ARP pastor, all of these different Presbyterian denominations today, they all require a very high bar for the minister to be trained. And that's continued on. And I think that's one of the reasons why we move slower, and it goes back again to that to that old side, new side question of what is sufficient education, what's the heart, how fast you want to move, and there are a lot of checks and balances within Presbyterianism that do slow us down, and sometimes that can be good, but sometimes it can be a little bit to our detriment. So Presbyterianism today, you still see a high bar for an educated pastor. And so you don't see a Presbyterian church necessarily on every street, but every Presbyterian pastor that you meet probably went to school for a really long time. And that's
a really long time, speaking from experience. Not me, you.
Really long time. And so in a very broad brush with much restraint and many rabbit trails that we did not run but could, that is basically the Reformed and Presbyterian Church.
Yeah. Next time we'll get more into a little bit more of the weeds.
We will. Oh, we will.
Well, until then. Be sure, leave a comment. Let us know what you think. If you have questions, comments, concerns, we want it all. And so we will collect those. We'll talk about them at a later date. Until next time.